talking about Mondrian and this radically reduced style of painting, where he's distilled it down to horizontals, verticals, primary colors, and shades of white, right? Various off shades of white. And how for Mondrian, this is the style, right? That's what the title de style means, is the style. Not a style, but a style the style that lies behind all other styles, right? That everything can be reduced to this. And this fits with that theosophical philosophy that said that there was one wisdom that lay behind all early cultures, all early religions, right? Same idea. There's one thing that leads to everything, right? And so this is that one thing for Mondrian. And it's the first painting we have that really is, it's not trying to be something else. It's not suggesting that there's any connection between it and anything else, right? Like even Malevich said, it's an airplane flying, it's a boy with a knapsack, right? And we saw how Kandinsky's forms had a sort of resonance with the physical world. But this is different. And so the painting itself there's no subject matter to it, right? It is something that's behind everything. It's like a scene out of The Matrix, when you see past the world and you see all the numbers, floating around. Is that too old of a reference too now? Keanu Reeves still looks pretty good for his age. Anyway, so for Mondrian, this is everywhere, right? He's very meticulous about how he paints it. We were looking at some details that looked at sort of the finickiness with which he arrives at the final solution, often using masking tape and extending the width of the line so you can see with the black on black even how areas are painted over the top of other areas, like the lines are painted last. But then he'll come back and I think he'll touch up the areas and play with those edges where the areas meet the blacks, right? And even though I say it's a painting of nothing, right? It's not a reference to the world in any way. We're not supposed to say, he derived that from a cow. That said, each of these spaces ends up sort of taking on a presence, an identity of its own, so that we could talk about the white square we have in the detail on the left, having an identity versus the bluish white square above it. There's a presence to these pieces. And what Mondrian wants, I'm sorry this is blurry, it didn't look so blurry on my computer, but you can see how well how meticulously he lays down the brushstrokes, and he's really thinking about it. It's not painted the same in the grid as it is in each of the areas of color. Our blue section is all horizontal, and our red section is painted there's a bit of horizontal, but he's come back over the top of it and painted it vertically, right? And you can see down below the white, all the strokes run horizontally, and then there's these little touches, right, where there's just that little hint of red so that the black bar doesn't always come all the way to the edge, right? He teases with it, and compositionally, you bring things close together, but they don't touch. There's a sort of visual tension that happens there, and that's Mondrian's playing with that as well. He sees endless variations within this, right? I mean, I'm just showing you ones that we can see in local collections, and as you can see, as he plays with this idea, he'll play with the ratios of the different parts, and each one takes on its own personality. Sometimes, like with this one, he doesn't use all three primaries, right? Just two of them, and then gives over a significant portion of it to one large white square, right? He really is exploring what are the infinite possibilities with this, and really there are sort of infinite possibilities with this simplicity, right? You just move lines around, you change the widths, you change the different proportions, and each one is going to look like a Mondrian, but at the same time is going to have its own sort of identity, personality, right? And this idea of the oneness behind everything, right, really comes through that way when you see the different pictures. Again, with details, we can see with this one that back and forth play that he gets with the different layers, right? Here, the black painted, and then it's obviously he's painted the white after that. And again, he's really really paying attention to those junctures, the places where the areas meet, because those intersections of color, white and black in this case, are become these areas of tension, right? And areas of variation, and they become areas where when you explore them long enough, they hold their own interest. You become aware of sort of how, for me at least, how fun it is to look at that line and look at how it varies, and how the thicknesses of the paint give it character, right? In this case, when we saw before, all the blacks seemed as if they were on top of the colors. This one now seems sort of just buried in a rut, and that gives it its own kind of identity. And again, you can see that he's playing with the paintbrush as well. How he lays down the strokes is for him extraordinarily important, right? And this is true, I think, for anybody that begins to approach any kind of reduction or simplicity or abstraction in their art, is that when you get rid of representation, when you get rid of those connections to the world outside, we mentioned this sort of theoretically, the painting only refers to itself, right? It doesn't make reference to something out there that you could compare it to. It makes reference back onto itself. It's almost like a meta text, right? It just says, okay, I'm it, right? And the subject matter becomes painting, right? Writ large. And so, if that's the case, then Mondrian, if the subject of the painting is painting, then it has to be painted. It has to sort of identify itself as something that is produced, by brush and paint on a surface. And Mondrian really emphasizes that here, right? Also, I think these things hold your attraction if you spend enough time with these. Right? They're very easy to walk by in the museum when you see them, because if you've seen one, you've sort of seen them all on a certain level. But at the same time, he negates that, right? Because each one is drastically different in proportions. And again, we can see that those edges, right, between them, and again, the thickness of the paint in these different areas, being parts of the elements that characterize his works. Well, right in the middle of the 1920s, he hit on this idea that if, in fact, what he's painting is this grid that exists everywhere, that is the harmony behind everything we see, then it shouldn't matter if I turn my canvas any direction. Does that make sense? So in other words, what the canvas really is this window beyond the visible world to this grid that is perfection and harmony out there. And if that's the case, then it shouldn't shift if you shift the canvas, right? And so he turns them on point, 45 degrees, right? Turns them on point, and the grid stays the same. Stays horizontal and vertical, because the grid isn't attached to the edges of the canvas. And I think those little gaps he leaves sort of hint at this idea that the grid isn't defined by the edges of the canvas. The grid is more than that. And by making what he calls lozenge compositions, they don't look like lozenges to me. I always think lozenges as being oval, like pills, or something like that. But that's what he calls them. He's, again, reiterating this idea that grid is out there, and all his painting does is reveal it, but it has to stay horizontal, vertical, and the primary colors, or else he violates the style, right? But what he can change is whether or not he puts them flat edge down or pointed edge down. Right? I was looking at the National Gallery stuff on this picture, and they say that this is actually the very first one he ever did where he put it point down, at least the very first one he did in this particular style that gave us that effect. And again, not to belabor the point, but for Mondrian, surface quality remains really important. And in this one, the blue doesn't reveal the same kind of brushstrokes. It looks more flat, opaque, than the ones we've seen before, and we can see that there is a different quality to the paint he's using for the grid. and it still seems as if it's been laid down with some help, right? Rulers and tape and whatnot. But the gloss on the blacks is distinctly different from the sort of matte surface of the blue. And we saw it shift on other pictures, right? So earlier when we saw the blue, the one we just had up a second ago, the blue was rather quite glossy, right? And other parts were matte. So each one, he's sort of playing with the paint, because that's the subject matter, is the paint, right? The subject matter is not something else out there on a certain level. Of course, the subject matter is that grid of harmony that the Theosophists believed was everywhere. Okay. So this is Mondrian, right, in a nutshell. And we get here around 1920, 1919, 1920, and he doesn't really change it until he dies. That makes it sound like he changed it when he died. He doesn't really change it through the rest of his life. There's some slight alterations in the late 30s and 40s, which we'll see. But they're still readily identifiable as Mondrians, right? Now, I said that he arrived at this idea in around 1919 or so, right? How did he get there? Right? What did Mondrian look like before he looked like Mondrian? Right? He was a rather traditional painter. Here's some early Mondrian, right, around the turn of the century. What did he look like? He looked like, what's his name? The astronaut, the hunk from Canada. Is in the new movie about Apollo 11.
Ryan Gosling?
That's it! Doesn't he look like Ryan Gosling? No. To me. He's got the long face. Anyway, I always thought that was Ryan Gosling in comparison. But there's a self-portrait. And on the left, a standard sort of Dutch landscape painting. Remember that Mondrian is from The Hague. He lives in Holland at first, before moving to Paris around 1911. And he starts off as a relatively traditional painter, doing relatively traditional subject matter, right? Now, the self-portrait is, to a Dutchman, kind of an important thing. There were famous Dutch artists who did a lot of self-portraits, Rembrandt being one of them, Van Gogh being another, right? And Van Gogh in 1900 is a relative contemporary, right? He died in 1890-ish, right? So that puts him as a rough contemporary. And certainly Rembrandt is a huge draw for him as well. These images of windmills, which are often the only thing higher than the horizon line in a Dutch landscape, a real Dutch landscape, not just a painting, became a symbol of Holland to a Dutchman to this day. Right, the windmill remains a symbol for the Dutch of their Dutchness, right? And so he's really working in incredibly traditional subject matter, and in a not particularly modern way. Right? He's not doing anything special with it that would make you think that we're going to get where we wind up in the next 15 years, right? Just these traditional scenes of Dutch landscapes. In 1908, he began to study spirituality. Right? This is when he starts to look into theosophy. It was in 1908. And as he begins to look into theosophy, his works get more expressive. Because what he's trying to illustrate as he gets into theosophy is not necessarily the object itself, but he's getting into this idea that there's something more to it than its physical appearance. Olivia. Than its physical appearance. And this leads him to increase the non-representational color that he uses, to increase the importance of the brushstrokes, the paint application within that, right? He's searching for something beyond the surface, right? And we see that here in the red tree. He also continues to dialogue with earlier Dutch artists, in particular Van Gogh. Here's a tiny little Van Gogh up in Baltimore at the Baltimore Museum, a figure in the landscape. But we can see that there's not a huge leap between the way Van Gogh envisions color and the application of paint, and using color and brushstrokes for, expressionism. There's not a whole huge difference between that and what Mondrian's doing a couple decades later, right? So he begins to, with his search for the spiritual side of things, right? And I'm using spiritual writ large. He begins with his works to look for something else in the subject matters that he paints. He also begins to look around at what other artists are doing in the first decade of the 20th century. And it's often commented that he begins to look toward Paris, see what's coming out of Paris. I don't know how many Fauve works he could have seen or would have seen in The Hague or Amsterdam. I don't know enough about Fauves to know how well they were shown in Holland. But do keep in mind that for you and me, it's easy to see these things. You just come to a classroom and write photography, or pick up a magazine. If you pick up magazines anymore, nobody does, but right, back in the day. The problem is that magazine printing in the early part of the 20th century was primarily black and white. So what could he have been picking up from these, except perhaps, obviously, a move toward greater abstraction, right? But he certainly seems to be picking up on all of that. Loves looking at the Fauves. We think maybe he's looking at the people from the Bridge, Kirchner and whatnot, for rather bright, supersaturated colors, right? And Germany is, in many ways, closer to where he was living, both sociologically and geographically, right? So these two things might have come into play. But it's important to remember at this point, 1909, he's still living in Holland, right? And developing these ideas sort of in the middle of nowhere, so to speak, right? Outside of the great art centers that we've been talking about. Then in 1911, he moves to Paris, right? And he gets there, if you just think back sort of what we've learned about Paris, what's going on in Paris around 1911? Cubism, right? Early Picasso and Braque are developing analytical cubism, right? They haven't hit synthetic cubism yet. It's analytical cubism. And there's those early pictures that tend to be monochromatic around brown. Those are the works that are the sort of most cutting-edge works to be seen in Paris. And on other occasions, like when we looked at the Germans, we talked about, or even the Futurists, we talked about the sort of Cubist revolution, right? Once Picasso and Braque start to exhibit these pictures, we see everybody get hit by it in the teens, right? It spins off Orphism. It spins off Purism. It spins off Futurism. All of these elements are picked up, and then late Kirchner gets all these angles in his works that come out of Cubism, right? Mondrian, still doing ostensibly the same subject matter, is obviously picking up on Cubism, right? So I brought in our Braque to put next to it, so we remember that color scheme, right? Brown with touches of green. And the way in which the world becomes fragmented so that foreground and background have equal status. Foreground and background have equal heft, weight within the work. They play an equally strong role. Mondrian is taking what Braque had done, what Picasso had done, where the background elements are constituents of the composition and look as if they're foreground elements, and vice versa. Well, he's doing that exact same thing with the flowering apple tree, right? But slightly different in that he's now focusing on the divisions between those shapes. And as he's looking at it, he's saying, okay, what I'm becoming more interested in, right, for Braque, is how does this interact with that, right? So these cubes, right, these prisms of space, how do those things interact with each other, right? That's and Brock are interested. But for Mondrian, he gets interested in the junctures, right? The splits between them. It starts to emphasize those and starts to see how the sort of the harmony of the composition is those intersection lines and how they play against each other, and how an arc this way can be sort of balanced by an arc that way. Does that make sense? Right? And so, you don't see these as shapes and units, three-dimensional shapes and units, in the same way that you in a cubist picture, what you see them as is the areas between these arches and lines that make up and spread across the entire composition. And you'll see what Mondrian's doing here as well is that he's moving from a picture about one thing, a tree, into a picture that is covering the entire surface with something. Right? That the flowering tree is equally over here, away from its trunk, equally over here. Right? We're getting to a point where he's making these pictures that actually do not have a figure against the ground. Right? And people say that Mondrian is really the first artist to ever give us a picture without a figure-ground relationship. Right? It just covers the entire surface, like moss, right? Mold. For Marymount students, it covers the entire surface like mold, right? It's sort of everywhere the same. And he keeps pushing this. The idea of the lines between that are suggested by the things he sees become sort of increasingly more important than the things he sees. And when he writes about art, right, he talks about the fact that these horizontal and vertical lines cancel each other out. They balance each other out, right? And I think when you see the title of this, right, Pier and Ocean, two things. One, that's not the entire title. Now he's starting to number them. Composition number 10, right? Because Pier and Ocean is becoming less important to him than the composition that he ends up with. It's the starting point starts to disappear, right? But knowing that it was Pier and Ocean, can you make it out still? Like there's a series of elements in the middle, quite like the apple tree here, where we have stronger horizontals than we have verticals. Is that right? No, stronger verticals than we have horizontals. Here in the middle, right? There's our pier going into the ocean. As we got to the ocean, we get stronger horizontals and verticals. Right? That's his translation of the scene. But again, we're sort of missing the point if we focus on the pier and the ocean. What we should be focusing on is this intersection of horizontals and verticals that end up, over the extent of the composition, balancing each other out. Right? At this point, he began to read a particular theosophist philosopher named Schoenmakers, M.H.J. Schoenmakers. He's a Dutch philosopher steeped in theosophy. And in fact, Schoenmakers was the one that gave him this idea about horizontals and verticals, right? That they were opposites that shape our world, that everything in the world, this is theosophical, can be seen as a melding of a series of horizontals and verticals, right? There's his theosophical unity behind everything. And Mondrian takes those ideas and said that these oppositions then neutralize each other, right? They produce equilibrium overall. Okay? And this is sort of what, again, continues to push him, right? As he investigates those ideas, he then moves to, this is probably the first of the overall grid pictures, and still a long way from where we were, but these are the steps that got him there, right? So he moves away from representational pictures, looking for something else behind the observed world. That then leads him to find something, and that something that he finds is geometry. And eventually that leads him then to find these primary colors, right? Much more variation in them. The reds are not all the same. The blues are not all the same. The yellows are not all the same. Eventually, that sort of falls out, right? And he'll have one red area, one blue area, one yellow area. And the only thing that will have the same variation that we see here would be the whites, right? That range of cool and warm, grayed out whites is something that then continues into the signature works, right? The works that we most associate with Piet Mondrian. Now, where am I on my list? In 1917, back up. I kind of left the historical element out of that. So what happened, with Mondrian, right? I'm going to go back quickly through these, right? Is he starts to do this sort of stuff, 1911, 1912, while he's in Paris, right? He had moved to Paris in 1911, and so these really Cubist-looking things are from his period in Paris. In 1914, when the war breaks out, the same thing happened to him that happened to Picasso. He's an expatriate. He's got to go home, right? And Mondrian goes back to The Hague in 1914, and he stays there through the war. Stays there all the way till 1919 when he goes back to Paris, right? So he spends 5 years working back in Holland. And that's where Mondrian does all of this, where he pushes it beyond what the Cubists were doing. And I think there's that isolation that helps him on a certain level, right? If he'd been in Paris, there'd be more opportunity to just follow, what's going on with other artists. But the fact that he's all by himself for the most part, right, for the first 3 years or so, working in relative isolation from the heavy hitters of the modern movements, allows him to discover something different from what everybody else had been doing, right? So that's a very important part of this, is that he gets to this point while he's working in Holland rather than in Paris, right? Now, in 1917, while he's back in Holland, he pairs up with another artist and really influences that other artist's work. But the other artist is also exploring abstraction. Theo van Doesburg, right, is also very much interested in the same ideas. They join forces, and this is where they name this gridded abstraction the style. This is where they coin the phrase de style. And they actually begin in 1917 to publish a journal. It was also called De Style. Okay. The journal has reproductions of their works, black and white, right? Plus writings, plus poetry. About 70% of the written parts are by Mondrian. Right? He can't stop talking about it. And I mean that in a good way. That sounds skanky, right? But he's one of the he's the primary theorist for De Style. On the other hand, Doesburg is the primary publicist. He's going to take the ideas that Mondrian's coming up with, the journal they're coming out with, and he's going to go out and make presentations, right? Take these ideas to others who might be interested in it, right? But they're working together after 1917, and the style of each of their works becomes increasingly similar, right? So here's a Van Doesburg from the Guggenheim, and you would be forgiven for mistaking it for Mondrian, but for my money, it shows why Mondrian's so darn good. I think it really does show off sort of these little subtleties that just make the Mondrians some of the great works of 20th century art. The things you might not notice at first, and it really takes, you need to spend some time with them before you realize how important the difference in the variation of the thickness of those lines is. Before you realize his interest in proportions and ratios, which you may not be able to measure. I'd love to, if I had a summer with nothing else to do, to go out and start thinking about ratios and Mondrian, and pulling out a ruler, and figuring out if what we're doing here, and how thick is the black compared to the white, and do we ever hit gold in rectangles and so forth, right? There's nothing wrong with Duisberg's work. I just don't think it has some of the subtlety, variation, and I would say some of the individuality, right? Mondrian's works come across as, even though they're all square, right? Even though they're all the same schema, there's something about them that comes across with an extraordinary personality in them, right? Now, Van Doesburg is an important player. Not only is he someone who helps them to publicize the style beyond Holland, right? Even after they've both moved to Paris to continue to publicize his works, but also Van Doesburg is also very interested, as is Mondrian, in the fact that this isn't really painting. Let me explain what I mean there, right? When Mondrian's making this painting, he sees it, on the one hand, as being an object, right? A new plasticism, he called it, right? So it is this painted object, and it has a strength of physicality about it, and that's why he frames it the way he does, is he wants you to think of it as this plastic object, right? This physical object. At the other hand, however, it's a revelation of the harmony that exists below the surface of things, right? And it's a reflection of something that exists beyond the edges of the canvas, right? And this is why you can turn them on the corner, and they would still be this way, right? Because it's not contained by the canvas, right? I think it's an important element, right? The thing that he's painting doesn't stop at the edges of the canvas. It goes on and on and on, right? Even though some of the lines stop shy of the edge, right? That's okay. They're picked up by another line somewhere that's just, off stage. If, in fact, what they're painting is something that doesn't end at the edges of the painting, then why shouldn't we take the next logical step? And instead of making paintings like this, let's make buildings like this. Let's stop thinking about a painting as being a work of art on a wall. Let's start thinking about the wall as being a work of art. Right? So let's stop thinking of paintings as being independent from the places where they hang. Let's make buildings that follow de style principles. And this is where Duisberg comes into play in a very strong way, right? Is this idea of applying de style principles to architecture, right? He begins to make designs for houses where individual walls will be painted different de style colors, right? They actually come up with, if you're in interior design, this is called an axonometric drawing. It's a drawing where perspective doesn't come into play, where the horizontals and verticals, you see top and sides, but everything's parallel, right? And that was actually invented by Duisberg and Mondrian to lay out their de style houses. But houses where, as you look at them, the whole point becomes that you see that blue and you stop thinking about it as a wall, and you start to think about it as a pane of blue, right? That reflects that metaphysical harmony that they've tried to have in their pictures. It doesn't stop at the end of the picture. It exists everywhere. And Van Doesburg and others began to work on these plans for architectural projects. None of them were ever carried out, except in little models, sometimes. But the idea is that if architecture applied these principles, we could create a perfect environment. We could create an environment where, instead of worrying about the ins and outs of everyday life, we would be constantly reminded of the perfection and harmony of the theosophical universe. Right? These would improve your life. These could we could build heaven. We could build a utopia. And part of that utopia, and Duisberg brings this out in his drawings, is that as you start to think of these colors, not as walls, but as color, just as a square of color, then all of a sudden the architecture starts to dematerialize. You stop thinking about it as construction, and you start thinking about it as this harmony. And the walls end up seeming to float almost because they're metaphysical. And in our contra construction on the right, you can see that he leaves out significant portions of the structure because what he's trying to illustrate for us is how those floating panes of color would affect us. Right? So it was planned kind of all along as Mondrian and Van Doesburg begin to really push toward this sort of mature de style. That's redundant. Mature de style idiom, right? They had always planned to not have it stay isolated to the canvas. It was going to be universal. And architecture is the next step, right? Mondrian's studio in Paris, he even decorated in de style, right? Where he would have squares that he would paint that weren't really architectural at all, but around the doorway, right? The wall would do this. When I was in grad school, my roommate Chris Mealy was doing modern art. He was docenting at MoMA. And one day I came home and he had painted the entire wall of the hallway that blue, right? De style blue. And he had painted the entire wall of his bedroom de style red. Just because he was thinking about this. And it worked, right? Even though this is an old sort of, pre-war New York crappy little apartment, right? You started looking at that wall and you stopped thinking about it. Okay, that just kind of connects the closet over here with the dining room over there. And you started seeing this wall just sort of hang there in a single color. Right? It really does have an extraordinary impact that way. Well, it did work out practically, right? Gerrit Rietveld had originally designed this chair back in around 1915 or so as just slats of wood, and then he paints it to style colors. Now, obviously, he can't be strictly to style because, chairs with perfectly flat seats and perfectly flat backs are perfectly uncomfortable, right? So he alters it a bit to, for comfort and whatnot, but what he's taking is Van Doesburg's idea of painting the elements to style colors, with the result being that they are dematerialized. And he's applying that to this chair so that the seat of the chair, it literally floats, right, on top of those two bars, but it looks like it floats. Or the back material, the red backing, also has that sense that it floats. And now the yellow spots become these sort of floating yellow spots because you dissociate them from the black arms on which they're resting. Right? This is how to style, right? And one of the icons of modern furniture. Right? And there was one prominent building in Utrecht, also designed by Gerrit Rietveld, that really tried to apply to style principles. And I used to spend a lot of time on this. I might try to go there. I'm going back to Holland in March, and there's a day I'm letting the students go play somewhere, and I might go down and try and see the Schroeder House because I always wanted to see it. And it's sort of fascinating because it's this really modern building, right? There's no peaks to the roof. We're used to these. Gaiac kind of looks this way, doesn't it? This is a box, right? But the idea of a building that's just a box in the 1920s was a rather radical idea. There were some buildings that were boxes, but they were like warehouses, right? Factories. But homes, there were rules about homes, right? You had peak roofs and whatnot. And this one sat at the end of an old 19th century row house, right? And this was on the very end of that. So the difference was that much more strong. But what Rietveld has done is to apply to style principles on the exterior. Panes of white in different shades of white, and then splashes of rectilinear primary colors that simply float around. Going inside, it's equally radical. The walls move, in fact. They're on sliders on the ceiling. So what we think of as a solidity in architecture, wall, can in fact move entirely out of the way. And he paints them in colors so that you think of them as these disembodied areas of color rather than as something solid and structural. And we can see that the top of the landing of the stairs is painted bright blue, the edge of the stairs going to the next floor up with that red. The yellow bit that you see here will actually fan out to the right and cover up the stairs that lead down, right? And re-parameter the space. Apparently this was so radical that the kids got made fun of at grade school, right? They're like, you live in that crazy house, right? Because people simply had not thought of this, but the parents loved it, right? And now it's open to the public. Another detail here where we can see, I'm sorry, this was scanned from a magazine years ago, but the rods on the ceiling are where the walls will slide out, and on the floor where we can see Rietveld's chair, the red part there can be reparametered into an entire room by moving the walls and the ceiling above it, right? So again, architecture becomes non-architecture. It becomes non-structure in a way. And how does it become that? It becomes that through the application of distyle principles, right? So we look at the floor and we see this design of openings, whites, blues, and reds, playing against yellows that are now vertical, moving through the house. It's really phenomenal, right, from what I think. Also in the corner where the fully red chair is back there, and there's that blue counter, the windows open up on the corner without a bar. Like they will swing open like this, and you can actually stand there in the corner and actually be outside when you're inside, right? Because the wings open up like this, and you're standing there, and you're surrounded by 270 degrees with outdoor air, right? Really radical. But again, for a movement that thought architecture was really where we're headed anyway, it's kind of amazing that we really only ended up with one anywhere, right, during the movement and built by them. Well, to wrap up Mondrian, right, he continues this style throughout the rest of his career, all the way to his death in the early 1940s. There's certain variations on the theme sometimes, especially as we get closer to 1940. For example, the one on the left from the Phillips, their newer work, if you will, has certain things we haven't seen in Mondrian before, whereas the 1935 piece from the Hirshhorn, certain similarities, right? In this case, earlier works, we would never see a red without a border around it, right? And now we see these red pieces sort of punctuating the work, sitting on top of the grid lines. It seemed as if in the earlier works and even into the 1930s that the grid lines contain the colors, right? That they're linked somehow to the grid lines. But as we move to the late 30s and early 40s, what we see is that the colors seem to become independent from that, right? And they're able to move across. You could almost imagine fixing a motor to this and having things sort of move around on the surface. As if the reds down below on a computer screen go up and down like this. You can see it. You can totally see this animated. And there's something about it when you look at it and you see that red on the left closest to me, or those three red dots in the lower right corner, that you're catching something in flux and you're seeing it, a still from a movie, rather than static work of art. Again, his meticulousness with painting hasn't gone away. The way he builds up that paint and plays not only with the direction of his brush strokes, but also the edge quality, right? And I get a feeling that some of that edge quality, if you look at the thin layer of yellow at the bottom, narrow layer of yellow at the bottom, that he's getting some of those edge qualities by where he's peeled up the tape, I think. Right, but somehow that's like a happy accident, because it gives more tension to that dividing line between the pieces. But again, all of these have that same sort of strength of meticulousness to the way in which he crafts the work. And he wants you to do what I'm doing here. He wants you to stick your nose in close, and understand that was for this particular bar, right, in the lower right corner, that little bit of white that's between the red and the black is kind of a necessary element, that every part counts. Every part means something. His last famous work, and one that you often see written up in 20th century works, this is at MoMA. I didn't put it up there as a Museum of Modern Art. Broadway Boogie Woogie, and it's huge, right? Well, it's four by 4 feet, so it's about like yay, right? And again, at this point, we can see he's radically changed. He's abandoned the black, right? At least the black outline. In fact, entirely. Even the bits that look almost black are in fact blue, and they just pick up black because of the rhythm and the colors that surround them. And in this particular case, again, if you move your eye around the piece and just start following the tracks, you realize you get a rhythm, right? Ba, 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 and you can almost imagine it being musical, right? And the title suggests that. Boogie Woogie, right? Is a style of jazz, very, very popular, big band jazz in the 30s. And I've got some Boogie Woogie. We'll play a little bit for you, right? But also calling it Broadway Boogie Woogie, he's moved to America by the 1940s. That's where he dies, is in America. Spends the last 3 years of his life in New York City. And we'll find out later, this is really important, right? He gets to New York just at the time that Jackson Pollock becomes interested in abstract painting, right? And the presence of people like Mondrian and others in New York that had expatriated out of Europe because of World War II, right? Now, Holland was neutral in World War I and was overrun by the Nazis in World War II, right? And Piet Mondrian, after the Nazi overthrow of Holland, moves to the United States. And one of the things he said was that the inspiration for this work was the gridded pattern of New York City, right? The street grid. And the movement of cars up and down the avenues and back and forth across the streets in New York. I think it's fascinating that he calls it Broadway Boogie Woogie because Broadway is the one street on the grid in Manhattan that doesn't go with the grid, right? Do you know New York City layout, right? Everything above 14th Street was planned, right, with Central Park, and it's all grid. It looks like a de style painting, right? Everything below 14th Street was old and wasn't planned and just sort of grew, right? And this is why there's a point in the West Village where West 4th Street crosses 14th Street. It's just crazy, right? Because they should, anyway. Above 14th Street, it's all meted up, except for Broadway, which used to be the old stage route that led from New York, right, up north into Connecticut. Yeah, and it went on an angle through. So that's why you get Times Square and Herald Square, right, and Union Square, is where Broadway crosses the avenues, okay? And that's what we're seeing here, Times Square. Broadway, 42nd Street. So it's interesting that he names it Broadway Boogie Woogie, given the fact that Broadway is the one street that doesn't obey the grid. And maybe that's part of what he's trying to say, is he's fixing it, Or maybe for him, as a Dutchman in New York, Broadway is just something that says New York. Would have been as cool as he had 6th Avenue Boogie Woogie. Well, Springsteen had 10th Avenue Freeze Out, so why not? But it does kind of complicate his timing. And then if we look at this as a postcard from the period, right, and we think about New York in the 40s, and we look at it, we start to think about these things as being cars moving on streets. Sometimes bottlenecked, right, and sometimes moving more freely, more open. Right? And that's certainly, I think, one of the things he said, that this was part of his plan with the work, right? The other thing, of course, is the boogie woogie side. And let's see, I hope this is going to play. Let's see if this will or not. I may have accidentally disabled the playing. We'll try. What I'm going to do is I'm going to close this for a second and try to and see if I can open it again, and we'll see a little Count Basie because he's pretty great, right? Let's see if this is going to let me do it. Enable content. That's what I want now. Where were we? Go here, there. Now, we'll see if it'll let it play or not. Oh, that's one too many. I should get a video. There. Count Basie. Okay, get over. Where's my mouse? Sorry about this. It better be worth it with all this, right? Okay, where's my... Do you see my mouse over there? I don't see my mouse all of a sudden. Well, zoot. The best laid plans of mice and men, right? Let's see if I just hit enter. Nope. Watch later, share. Why can't I... My mouse isn't showing up on my screen and not showing up over there. Play it on... The PowerPoint is up on Canvas, right? And you can hear... Basie's great, but I really wish you could see it because his face is so fantastic and it's so joyful. And the sound is just this bouncy, bumpy rhythm, right? That totally reminds me and I think him of what he's trying to do here. Where's my gosh darned mouse? Give me just one more second here because I really want that. And I'm not seeing it anywhere. No, it's not coming back. So we'll move on. Sadly, you won't see Count Basie here, right? So we have to move on. The Bauhaus. So that kind of wraps up the style for us, right? The style is primarily, there's about 6 or 7 guys in there, but Mondrian is the only one that's really worth talking about. The Bauhaus became, back up. What we're moving to here in this section of the class, right, is we spent sort of the first, third of the class talking about the decades that led up to World War I, right? So we're looking at a bunch of movements that all sort of culminated in the first 15 years of the 20th century, not counting symbolism, right, which is 19th century. But Expressionism in 3 different variations, right? Just straight up Expressionism plus the bridge and the Blue Rider, all sort of culminate before the war. Futurism kind of culminates before the war. Cubism, Fauvism, right? These are all sort of pre-war movements, and they share a certain something. They share a certain utopian hope, right? That the world's going to be a better place. And then the war. And something happens during the war, and people begin to realize that this utopian joy that they're hoping for is not going to keep. Right? And we start to see a sort of shift in mood with World War I, 1914, 1918. And we're starting to look at some of the works or some of the movements that are very much inspired by that. Right? So Mondrian and his embrace of abstraction can be seen as a reaction to the war. Right? Because he had gone back to Holland, he had to leave Paris, and it's at that point that he abandons any reference to the physical world. And it's very easy to see why one might want to do this, right? Kandinsky, when he finally really does push himself over to abstraction and away from sort of references back to horses and villagers and churches and whatnot, right? That happens when he's in Russia, and he's also fled Munich because of the war. Right? Franz Marc dies. Right, he's killed in the war. Hey, there's a big Franz Marc show up in New York at the Neue Gallery. Franz Marc and August Macke, another Blue Rider artist, just opened. 2 of our pictures are there. The weasels and the Siberian dogs on loan. Okay, Malevich, right, and his interest in abstraction, because Russia was neutral in World War I, right, like Holland, and that allows these artists to sort of look at the war from outside, even though they're still in Europe. Right? America was neutral for the first part of this as well, right? Okay. After the war, we see various reactions looking back. Okay? Huge impact from World War I, and we'll see another movement coming up that reacts to World War I in a different way than anybody who talked about it. Right? But after the war, in Germany in particular, there were reactions to the war. Right? Reactions, sometimes political, sometimes practical. And in 1919, the German government, now the war is over, right, see a need to rebuild Germany because of all the destruction from World War I. And they decide that, the government decides that they want to do it right. They want to do it well. And so they look to some prominent architects who had been around from before the war as well. There was this group called the German Work Group, the Deutsche Werkbund, that had been around before the war, and they had become very much interested in trying to work with industrial leaders, leaders of industry, to make designs hand in hand with the leaders, so that the industrial leaders wouldn't destroy good design just to make it cheap. Right? We want to work with them because it's going to happen anyway. So let's make sure we can maintain some interest in good design, excellent craftsmanship, right? Just as industry is going to take over the production of things. We'll work with them, design for industry. Right? And this was happening before the war. So after the war, the German government decided, we've got to rebuild Germany, we've got to get industry involved, otherwise it's going to take too darn long, cost too much. But let's do it right, let's get the creators involved, let's get the artists involved in this, right? And they hire this guy, Walter Gropius, who was a fairly prominent member of this German work group, the Deutsche Werkbund, prior to the war, to found a new school to teach the next generation of architects and designers, to teach them the principles of good design and how the principles of good design can be married to industry. And for Gropius, what he sees is the need to hold on to some traditions. And for Gropius, one of the traditions he wants to hold on to is the tradition of handcraft, craftsmanship. He does not really want machines to be doing everything. Right? The power of the hand, right? The human touch remains for Gropius very, very important. Well, he's hired in 1919 to found this school called the Bauhaus. Right? More than just a 90s post-punk band. Right? The architecture school. And the term Bauhaus, which you see obviously advertised on the side of the building, in German it just means building. Bauen is a building. Bau or built. House is house. Right? So the name is kind of nonsensical in a way, or redundant, right? Built house. The idea is that they're going to be training young artists to become architects and build the New Germany the right way. Now, Gropius comes up with a radical curriculum. There it is in German, but, right? I don't expect you to be German, so there it is in English. Okay, this is the Gropius layout of his curriculum. You started off with a half-year preliminary course, right? You would then move from that to various kinds of studies. You would move to that to focusing on different materials, and at the end, you'd work on the building. And his idea was, right, that architecture isn't just engineering, right? It isn't just a study of physics. That architecture encompasses all the arts. Right? That architecture is sculpture. That architecture is painting. That architecture is drawing. That architecture is wood. You have to know how wood behaves. Right? Architecture is stone. Architecture contains chairs, so you need to know textiles. Right? Wall hangings. Architecture has windows, so you need to understand glass, and in particular, sort of paned glass design. Right? These were all part of it. So an architect, right, had to know everything. Right? This is his curriculum, and everything. It's like a dartboard, right? Everything leads to the bullseye, which is the building. Okay. And what they're going to learn when they're at the Bauhaus is a thorough study of nature, materials, tools, preliminary theoretical course, which is kind of out there, right? Very esoteric. And it would all lead to the building, which was the testing site for all these ideas, right? And for Gropius, even though he's trained as an architect, the whole idea of the curriculum is that it would be artistic. Because for him, again, handicraft. So, the people that he hires to teach these courses are not architects, right? But are the most prominent painters of the day. And it becomes this place where not only do we pick up different ideas that are coming out of expressionism, right? Constructivism, the style, right? These things start to come together at the Bauhaus. Because there's not much difference between them at the end of the day. Right? And Gropius understands that, and he wants his students to get it as well. So, 1919, they hire Gropius, and he sort of immediately begins to hire people to teach. Right? Now, there's some things that come out of this, right? First, with the target, where you move from theory, right, through to practice. Theory lays at the base of it on the outside. We move through that to studying how we might do things to the materials we would work on, and then we apply it to the work. The core mantra at the Bauhaus is that with any design, I'm really sorry about that slide on the right. I didn't realize it jaggled like that. With any good design, the designed form, the building, right, or anything that's in the building, the form should follow the function. Now, that's become something you've probably heard before. Form follows function, right? But a designer should not design things where the form differentiates from what the thing is supposed to do. Form follows function. So the Bauhaus school itself contained different buildings that had different functions. This is the second Bauhaus building. The first one was a building they inherited, right? It was closed down. They rebuilt in a different city. The big glass building is where the studio workshops all were. And the form follows the function. You need natural light, so we have a glass curtain wall. But also, Gropius wanted this to serve society. So he wanted it to look as if there was no separation between art and the world outside. Big glass curtain wall, right? Some of the dorms are behind it, and you can see the structure is drastically different. The administrative offices in the right-hand slide off to the left also differently function, because form follows function, right? That becomes one of the mantras of the Bauhaus. And it led with Bauhaus designs. Here's Gropius's director's studio in the old building where they began. That led to it being particularly geometrical in its designs, because he felt that design really should reveal the original function and shouldn't be unnecessarily ornamented, right? That wonderful lamp with the 3 fluorescent rods at the top, the boxy chair, the rug and the textile on the wall, all designed out of Bauhaus shops. And again, that kind of geometry is something that is a hallmark of Bauhaus architecture. The original Bauhaus was in the city of Weimar. Weimar was in the early German Republic after the war, was the center of government. Often call that period the Weimar Republic. And in addition to that, the government was particularly liberal, avant-garde. They were willing to take some risks and do some extraordinary new things. In part, because they're separating themselves from what had just happened, right? In 1925, there was a series of elections in Weimar, and that led to a new right-wing government, and they shut down the Bauhaus. So Gropius relocated to Dessau, a different city, and built the new building. Right? Bauhaus history. Now, this whole idea that all of the arts are architecture, right? That it's the mixing pot for everything, obviously attracted other people, right? And Theo van Doesburg in 1922 actually moved to Weimar just to be close to Bauhaus, because he said, this is the best chance we got to take the style and do what we wanted to with it. So this is a nice little artifact. He took a postcard of the old technical school that was inherited by Gropius, and he doodled all over it, and the style takes over the Bauhaus, right? By writing on each of the planes simply the style, everywhere you can see, right? His idea was that he was going to go there and he was going to say, okay, Walt, you want to build architecture that involves all of the arts. There's only one way to do that. It's the style. We've been talking about this for years, right? You need us and we need to work together. And he stays there, right, for 3 or 4 years, Van Doesburg does, trying to convince Gropius and the members of the Bauhaus that the style is the only way that you can achieve what you want to achieve, which is an architecture that encompasses all the arts where we don't distinguish between them. And he's able to collaborate. He works on some publications, right? So here's the sixth Bauhaus book. They came out of the Bauhaus, and you can see it's obviously a style cover, right? And he's really trying to get this, but they're not going to adopt the style as the lone style that they want, right? And what Gropius has in the back of his mind instead is to really get a wide range of the most avant-garde thinkers together. To work, not only teach within this curriculum, but just to be part of this community, right? And the first artist that he hires, the very first artist that he hires to work at the Bauhaus and teach, is an American expatriate named Lionel Feininger. Right? He was an American expat. He had been living in Germany since the late 1880s. He moved there when he was 16. His parents were German immigrants to the United States. So he grew up speaking German, right? Decides to go visit Germany, stays, never leaves. Is still there 30 years later when Gropius hires him as the very first professor at the Bauhaus, right? Prior to joining the Bauhaus in 1919, Feininger had been a member of the Bridge with Kirchner and a member of the Blue Rider with Klee and with Kandinsky and Franz Marc. So he brings with him a wide range of perspectives related to German Expressionism. Right? He also brings with him, from both of those movements, this idea that art can build a better future, right? So for the Bridge, right, art can point us to the next level of our evolution, right? That idea of becoming Übermensch, right? Or for Kandinsky, that art can give us a pathway to the infinite, right? To this theosophical harmony that's out there somewhere. Right? that idea that there's a beacon, right? That art can move us forward. And so this is the cover to the Bauhaus Manifesto. And it's very sort of expressionist looking, kind of quasi-cubist. Well, that's, again, it's everywhere, right? And it's a cathedral topped by these three stars that are these beacons shining outward, right? The cathedral doesn't mean it's particularly religious, rather that it's just spiritual, like in the hands of Kandinsky, right? It's just a spiritual theme. And he brings this interest to the Bauhaus, right? He's hired on purpose because he's got that idea of the role that art can play in shaping the destiny of mankind, right? That's important. We don't think that anymore, do we? I mean, I love the idea that they thought it could work. And I think we should all think that what we do, right? Criminal justice, right? Is that your are you IT or IT? What was your major? Liberal studies. But and whatever your major may be, and most of you are art majors, right? You're my lone, and your history, politics. Whatever we do with our lives, we could make a difference, you know? And we don't think that enough. And I think that there's a bigger lesson to take from all of this. It's that what we do matters. Or it can, if we do it well, if we do it right. They firmly believe that the art that they've made could, in fact, move us to a better psyche, or even move us to a better future. And if more of us put stock in that, the world would be a heck of a lot better place, right? Now, expressionist ideas are not only important for that utopian bit for Gropius and the Bauhaus, but they're important for other reasons. One, it's a woodcut, okay? Now think about woodcuts. Remember how much the expressionists liked woodcuts because they were old? They were German, they were traditional, but they're now using that old tradition to modernize the world. And they like that sort of edgy, rough-cut look of a woodcut, and so does Feininger, right? But it's also a man working with a physical material, and wood is part of the Bauhaus curriculum. You understand wood. And if you're going to make a woodcut, you've got to understand wood, because otherwise you don't work with the grain, right? You work against the grain, as we still say all over the place, right? So that's very much important, was that the Bauhaus was interested in craftsmanship. And hiring an expressionist artist who loves woodcuts is part of that interest in craftsmanship. The second thing is that the title that Feininger gave this before it was used as the cover to the Bauhaus Manifesto was the Cathedral of Socialism. Socialism is pretty new, right? A couple years old is all. And at this point, you know, we look at socialism now and we have a lot of doubts because of the way it panned out over the course of the 20th century, right? In Russia, didn't work so well. Not that Russia's been all that great a place after socialism, right? But nonetheless, the way socialism panned out, we tend to look at it with, we've taken off our rose glasses. But in the early years of socialism, it was seen as this radical new, world-changing viewpoint that might point to this utopian, perfect future. One where all people were equal. That's part of what socialism, communism is that you're part of society, you're part of the community. And I'm going to talk about it in non-judgmental terms here, right? That you're part of society, part of the community, and you're not just working for yourself, right? You're working for the good of the community. And if you're doing that, the community will give back to you, right? Based on your input. Okay. So it's not about personal gain, it's about community service in the broader sense. These are reductive, right? Reduced very much this way, right? So for the Bauhaus, what we find through the history of the Bauhaus is that they're very much interested in socialism, because socialism says that there are no class differences. And the Bauhaus wants to design for the people, where everybody can enjoy the same high-quality, good design. That industry is how we can do that. That in tradition, well-designed, craftsman-made things were reserved for the few with a lot of money. Industry allows that to be more democratic, more widespread. So socialist ideas are going to be at the heart of the Bauhaus through much of its development. Right? So Feininger is the first one that's hired, right? He comes, he brings a sort of expressionist quality. He was sort of all over the map. He had, right? He'd been to Paris. He was in Paris when the Orphists were just getting started, right? When Picasso and Braque are pioneering Cubism, when the Futurists are publishing their manifesto and showing their works in Paris, Feininger is there, does Futurist-styled works. Right? Does beautiful Cubist-styled works, but architectonically designed around buildings, right? But still have that early Cubist flair to them. Right? And then finally, one last, and then we'll quit. One last Feininger. These are the sorts of works he was doing before he was hired at the Bauhaus, right? And they must certainly have something to do with why Gropius wants him. He's not just an expressionist artist. He's an artist who shows a solid knowledge and application of numerous modern movements and can bring that synthesis to teaching different courses at the Bauhaus. Now, what we'll see next week is that other people are coming in. Really important people, right, are showing up at the Bauhaus as well. So we'll finish that up on Tuesday. And then I think we move forward from that to Dada or Expressionism. I'm not quite sure which is coming up next. It's on the list. Okay? Again, sorry about